As the crowd pressed forward in St. Peter's Square, 7-year-old Sophia Moretti stood on her tiptoes, her small hand clutching a worn rosary. Just moments ago, she had spotted Pope Leo XIV emerging onto the balcony, his white cassock gleaming. In the May sunshine, the newly elected pontiff, the first American pope in history, raised his hands in blessing, his warm smile radiating across the sea of faces. But Sophia wasn't just another child in the crowd. When their eyes met across the impossible distance, she slowly raised her little hand, thumb and pinky extended, the 3 middle fingers curled against her palm, the universal sign for "I love you" in sign language. What happened next left the Swiss guards frozen in place, their ceremonial halberds trembling in their grip, because Pope Leo XIV immediately returned the gesture, the exact same sign, before tapping his heart twice with his fist. No one could have predicted what this silent exchange would unleash, or how it would transform not just Sophia's life, but shake the very foundations of the Vatican itself. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories of incredible human connections and faith that crosses boundaries, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. Sophia's journey to that pivotal moment in St. Peter's Square began thousands of miles away in a small village outside Chicago. Born with profound hearing loss, she had never known a world of sound. Her mother, Elena, a devout Catholic immigrant from Italy, had taught her daughter to pray with her hands when words failed. Sophia's father, Marco, worked 2 jobs to afford the specialized education his daughter needed, often coming home long after she had fallen asleep. "We're going to Rome," Elena announced one evening, after receiving news that her elderly aunt in Italy had passed away, leaving them a modest inheritance. "The new pope is American, just like you, Sophia. They say he knows sign language. We'll go see him give his blessing." What Elena didn't tell her daughter was that doctors had recently discovered a tumor growing in Sophia's brain. The prognosis was uncertain. This trip might be their only chance to fulfill Sophia's greatest wish, to see the Pope in person. The inheritance money would barely cover their travel expenses, but Elena was determined. If they couldn't afford the treatment Sophia might soon need, at least they could give her this one precious memory. The Moretti family arrived in Rome on a warm Wednesday in late May 2025, just 2 weeks after Cardinal Robert Prevost had been elected and taken the name Leo XIV. The city was still buzzing with excitement over the historic selection of the first American pope, a humble man from Chicago who had spent decades serving the poor in Peru before his appointment to the Vatican. Sophia's parents had told her they would attend the Pope's general audience on Friday, but they had a surprise planned. Through a series of fortunate connections, a distant cousin who knew someone who worked in Vatican housekeeping, they had secured 3 tickets to a special Thursday morning blessing that would be less crowded. As they made their way through security checkpoints, Elena noticed Sophia's hands trembling. "Are you scared?" she signed to her daughter. Sophia shook her head. "Not scared," she signed back. "I have a message for him. A secret." Elena knelt down beside her daughter. "What secret, tesoro?" Sophia smiled mysteriously and touched the bulge in her pocket where she kept her special rosary, the one her grandmother had given her before passing away. "You'll see. It's between me and God." The family found a spot near the barrier, close enough to see the balcony clearly. The square was filling quickly despite the private nature of the audience. Pope Leo XIV had quickly become beloved for his informal, approachable style that reminded many of his predecessor, Pope Francis. He often broke protocol to connect directly with the faithful. As they waited, Marco lifted Sophia onto his shoulders so she could see better. Elena noticed a Swiss guard watching them carefully, a tall, stoic man with the distinctive blue, red, and yellow uniform that hadn't changed in centuries. Something about his intense gaze made her uneasy. When Pope Leo XIV finally appeared on the balcony, a hush fell over the crowd. At 69 years old, he moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had spent decades in contemplative prayer. Yet his eyes were alert and kind, scanning the crowd as if looking for someone specific. Sophia began to wave frantically, and then, as if by miracle, the Pope's eyes found her. The little girl's hands moved swiftly, forming the sign for "I love you," the universal gesture that transcends spoken language. What no one expected was for the Pope to immediately respond with the same sign, followed by the tapping of his heart. The Swiss guard nearest to the Moretti family stiffened visibly. He touched his earpiece, eyes narrowing as he studied Sophia with sudden intensity. Two more guards quickly converged on their position, their ceremonial role taking on a startlingly serious edge. "What's happening?" Marco whispered to his wife as the guards approached. Before Elena could answer, the tallest guard spoke in accented English. "The child. She must come with us." "What? Why?" Elena protectively pulled Sophia down from her father's shoulders. "By direct request of His Holiness," the guard said more gently, seeing the fear in the mother's eyes. "Please, it is a great honor. You may both accompany her." Bewildered, the Moretti family found themselves escorted through a side entrance away from the main crowd. They passed through corridors of breathtaking beauty, marble hallways lined with priceless art that Sophia couldn't hear being described but could feel in her soul as her wide eyes absorbed everything. Finally, they were led into a small, simple room where Pope Leo XIV waited, having descended from the balcony with unusual haste. He had dismissed all but two of his attendants, and when Sophia entered, he smiled with tears in his eyes. "Sophia," he said, simultaneously signing her name. Elena gasped. "Your Holiness, how do you know her name?" The Pope knelt to Sophia's level, his papal robes pooling around him on the floor, a gesture that shocked even the guards present. "Because," he signed to Sophia as he spoke for her parents' benefit, "I have been waiting for you." Sophia's hands flew in a flurry of signs, too quick for her parents to follow completely. Pope Leo XIV nodded gravely. "Yes, I understand," he signed, back, his eyes never leaving hers. "Show me." Sophia reached into her pocket and pulled out her rosary. But it wasn't just any rosary. The beads had been arranged in a distinct pattern, alternating colors that would seem random to most observers. She placed it in the Pope's outstretched hand. "Do you know what this is?" the Pope asked the stunned parents, his voice thick with emotion. "My mother's rosary," Elena whispered. "She gave it to Sophia before she died last year." The Pope shook his head gently. "This pattern, it's a code, one created over 40 years ago by a small group of deaf Catholics in Chicago who felt excluded from the church." He looked at Sophia with wonder. "How did you know to bring this to me?" Sophia's hands moved again, signing. "Grandma said you were there. You were the young priest who helped make it. She said when the right time came, I should show you the rosary." The Pope closed his eyes briefly, visibly moved. "Elena, your mother, what was her name?" "Isabella Romano," Elena replied, confusion evident in her voice. Pope Leo XIV released a shuddering breath. "Isabella was my first student when I was learning sign language as a young seminarian in Chicago. She helped create this special rosary, coding system so deaf parishioners could communicate certain needs discreetly during times when sign language was still stigmatized." Marco stepped forward. "Your Holiness, I don't understand. What does this mean?" The Pope looked up at them, still kneeling at Sophia's level. "It means your daughter has brought me a message I've been waiting decades to receive. This particular arrangement of beads..." He swallowed hard before continuing. It signals that the bearer needs urgent help but cannot speak of it openly. Elena's hand flew to her mouth as tears sprang to her eyes. They hadn't told Sophia about her diagnosis, wanting to protect her from fear during their trip. How could she possibly know? Sophia, the Pope signed gently. What is the help you need? Sophia's small hands formed precise signs. Not for me. For all children who cannot hear God's word. Grandma said you promised to build a place where hands could speak prayers. She said you would remember. Understanding dawned on the Pope's face, a mixture of awe and humbling recognition. The promise I made to Isabella and the others, that if I ever had the power to truly help, I would create a place within the church where deaf children could fully participate in their faith. He looked up at Elena and Marco. 45 years ago, as a young priest working in Chicago, I made a promise to a group of deaf parishioners that one day I would help establish a special ministry for deaf children worldwide. We created this coding system in the rosary beads so they could discreetly identify one another and their specific needs during a time when many deaf people were still marginalized. The Pope stood slowly, his knees creaking slightly. I never imagined I would rise to this position, and in the overwhelming responsibilities that have come with it, I nearly forgot that promise. He looked down at Sophia with immense gratitude. Until this child reminded. Me. One of the Swiss guards who had escorted them cleared his throat. Your Holiness, forgive me, but this explains the security alert. When we saw the hand signal exchange, it triggered our protocols. That specific gesture, followed by the heart tap, is listed in our security codes as an ancient signal used for identifying members of a protected group under Vatican care. The Pope nodded. Yes, Captain. A code established generations ago but seldom used. I recognized Sophia's gesture immediately. He turned to the Moretti family. What you have done today, what your daughter has done, is awakened a promise that has lain dormant for too long. Elena, still processing this extraordinary turn of events, found her voice. Your Holiness, there's something you should know about Sophia. She hesitated, glancing at her daughter who was watching their lips carefully. She's been diagnosed with a brain tumor. The doctors in Chicago aren't certain about treatment options. The Pope's expression shifted to one of deep compassion. Then, God's timing is, as always, perfect. He placed his hand gently on Sophia's head. The Vatican has connections to some of the finest medical institutions in the world. We will ensure Sophia receives the best care possible. Sophia tugged at the Pope's robe and signed rapidly when she had his attention. What did she say? Marco asked, unable to follow her quick movements. The Pope smiled. She says she's not afraid of the tumor. She says God sent her here not for healing, but for remembering. For reminding me. He looked at the child with profound respect. Out of the mouths of babes comes wisdom. The news of the mysterious exchange between Pope Leo XIV and a little deaf girl from Chicago spread quickly, despite the Vatican's initial attempts to keep the meeting private. Smartphone videos captured the moment on the balcony. The girl's hand signal, the Pope's immediate response, and the swift reaction of the Swiss guards. Within hours, the clip had gone viral, sparking wild speculation. What few could have anticipated was how this moment would catalyze one of the most significant initiatives of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate. 2 weeks after meeting Sophia, the Pope made a historic announcement: the creation of the Pontifical Commission for Inclusive Ministry, with a special focus on deaf Catholics and others with disabilities who had long struggled for full inclusion in church life. The church must be a home for all God's children, Pope Leo XIV declared in his announcement, delivered in both spoken word and sign language. Too often, those who cannot hear have been unable to fully participate in their faith. Today, that changes. What made this initiative particularly remarkable was the Pope's insistence that it be led not by Vatican officials, but by deaf Catholics themselves, and he named an honorary young advisor to the commission, Sophia Moretti. For Sophia, the months following her Vatican encounter were transformative in more ways than one. The tumor that had threatened her life was successfully removed at Gemelli Hospital in Rome, where the Pope himself visited her recovery room, bringing a newly created rosary with beads specifically designed for deaf prayer, a system that would soon be replicated worldwide. As Sophia recovered, her story spread throughout deaf communities across the globe. The Sophia signal, as it became known, the I love you hand sign followed by the heart tap, was adopted as a symbol of the new commission, representing the bridge between spoken and signed faith. The Swiss guards, whose startled reaction had initially seemed alarming, became unexpected champions of the cause. Captain Lorenzo Bianchi, the guard who had first approached the Moretti family, requested special permission to learn sign language and became an advocate for security protocols that better served visitors with disabilities. What shook us that day wasn't fear, Captain Bianchi later explained in an interview. It was recognition. In our centuries of service, we've been trained to protect the Pope from threats. But in that moment, we realized we'd also been unknowingly carrying an ancient promise. This code embedded in our protocols that few understood the origin of. When the Pope and the child exchanged those signals, it was like watching history come full circle. 6 months after their first meeting, Sophia stood once again in St. Peter's Square. This time she wasn't an anonymous face in the crowd, but an honored guest at the inauguration of the Vatican's first school for deaf ministry. Beside her stood her parents, healthy and radiant with pride, and Pope Leo XIV, who had become not just a spiritual leader, but a personal friend. As they prepared to cut the ribbon on the new school building, a beautiful structure designed with acoustics and visual aids specifically for deaf students, the Pope turned to Sophia. "You know," he signed, to her, speaking simultaneously for the audience, "there is an old saying that God writes straight with crooked lines. Your grandmother Isabella never lived to see this day, but she planted a seed 45 years ago that you brought to harvest." Sophia smiled and signed back. "Grandma told me one more thing before she died. She said sometimes angels don't have wings. Sometimes they have hands that speak." The Pope translated her words for the crowd, which responded with a wave of the Sophia signal, thousands of hands showing I love you, followed by heart taps, a silent applause that Sophia could finally fully experience. As the ribbon was cut and the doors to the new school opened, Pope Leo XIV reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. A promise made decades ago to a small community in Chicago, a rosary coded with a forgotten message, a child's courage in delivering it, and the Swiss Guards' reaction that had initially seemed shocking but had ultimately helped legitimize the importance of what was happening. The following Sunday, Pope Leo XIV devoted his homily to the concept of divine messaging. "God doesn't always speak through thunder," he told the gathered faithful. "Sometimes he speaks through the silent hands of a child. The question is, are we watching closely enough to understand?" Around the world, parishes began installing screens with sign language interpreters. Schools for the deaf incorporated religious education that respected their unique culture rather than treating deafness as something to be overcome. And in New Chicago, the small church where a young Father Prevost had first learned to sign from Isabella Romano was designated as a pilgrimage site for deaf Catholics. For Sophia, now 8 years old and cancer-free, the most important change was simpler. When she prayed now, she no longer felt like her words were struggling to reach heaven. Instead, she imagined God watching her hands move, understanding every gesture, every emotion conveyed through movement rather than sound. 1 year to the day after their first meeting, Sophia returned to the Vatican for a private audience with Pope Leo XIV. The Swiss guards who escorted her now greeted her in fluent sign language, and Captain Bianchi had become a particular friend, often sending her letters with updates on his signing progress. In the Pope's private study, Sophia presented him with a gift, a book she had helped create, filled with prayers translated into sign language with beautiful illustrations showing how to form each sign. It was the first volume in what would become a comprehensive library of deaf religious resources. "Your Holiness," she signed as her mother interpreted. "Do you remember when you asked me why I wasn't afraid of the tumor?" The Pope nodded, his eyes kind. "I wasn't afraid because Grandma Isabella told me that some people are born with special missions. Mine wasn't just to deliver her message to you, it was to help build this bridge between worlds." Her small hands shaped each sign with precision beyond her years. "Thank you for hearing me when I couldn't speak." Pope Leo XIV, the first American pope who had risen from humble beginnings in Chicago to the highest position in the Catholic Church, knelt before the little girl. In this private moment, without cameras or crowds, he signed back to her. "No, Sophia. Thank you for helping me remember that true leadership begins with listening, not just with our ears, but with our hearts." As word of the Vatican's inclusive ministry spread, religious leaders from other faiths reached out, seeking guidance on creating similar programs. What had begun as a private exchange between a pope and a child had sparked an interfaith dialogue about accessibility and inclusion that transcended theological differences. The Swiss Guards, once known primarily for their distinctive uniforms and ceremonial role, underwent a transformation as well. Under Captain Bianchi's leadership, they established a specialized unit trained in communicating with visitors who had various disabilities. Their reaction that had once shook everyone in surprise became a model of compassionate security protocol, adopted by protection details around the world. 3 years later, as Sophia grew into a confident young advocate for deaf children, she received an unprecedented honor, an invitation to address the College of Cardinals. Standing before the Church's most senior leaders, many of whom had initially been skeptical of the Pope's emphasis on inclusive ministry, she delivered a presentation entirely in sign language, with her mother voicing her words. "The greatest barrier between people isn't language or ability," she signed, her movements graceful and assured. "It's the assumption that difference means distance, but in God's eyes, our differences are just different ways of reflecting His image." Cardinal Rosario, one of the most traditional members of the college who had initially opposed what he considered unnecessary changes to church protocol, was the first to rise in a standing ovation. Later, he would admit that watching Sophia sign had been a spiritual experience, for him, like seeing prayer made visible. Pope Leo XIV, now in his 4th year as pontiff, used the occasion to announce the expansion of the inclusive ministry to focus not just on deaf Catholics, but on all those with disabilities who sought full participation in their faith. The program would be named the Sophia Initiative, a recognition of how one child's courage had changed the Church. For the Moretti family, life had found a new rhythm. Elena now worked as a coordinator for deaf ministry in dioceses throughout Italy. Marco had started a foundation to help families of children with disabilities afford travel to religious sites. And Sophia, growing into her role as an unexpected ambassador, divided her time between school in Chicago and speaking engagements around the world. "Did you ever imagine this would happen when you taught me that hand sign?" Sophia asked her mother, one evening as they sat on the balcony of their new home overlooking the Tiber River. Elena shook her head, signing as she spoke. "I taught you, 'I love you,' because it was the first sign your grandmother taught me. I never knew it would change the world." Sophia smiled. It wasn't the sign that changed things. it was that someone important finally saw it. On the 5th anniversary of their first meeting, Pope Leo XIV invited Sophia back to St. Peter's Square for a special Mass celebrating the achievements of the inclusive ministry. As she took her place in the front row, Sophia noticed that every single Swiss guard on duty was wearing a small pin on their uniform, the now famous Sophia signal, rendered in gold. Captain Bianchi, now the head of the Swiss Guard, caught her eye and winked before resuming his solemn demeanor. The guard's reaction that had once shook everyone with its intensity had transformed into a proud tradition of protection and inclusion. As Pope Leo XIV delivered his homily, simultaneously signing the most important passages, he paused to acknowledge the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 5 years ago, a child reminded me of a promise I had nearly forgotten, he told the assembled crowd. She showed us that sometimes the most profound communications require no sound at all. In the silence of her gesture was the voice of God, calling us to remember that every person, regardless of ability, carries the divine spark. The Pope looked directly at Sophia. In our church's long history, we have built magnificent cathedrals with soaring ceilings to lift our prayers heavenward. But this child taught us that the true cathedral is the human heart, and that God hears prayers formed by hands just as clearly as those spoken by lips. As the Mass concluded, Sophia was invited to offer the final blessing alongside the Pope, her hands forming the sacred words as he spoke them. The image of the pontiff and the young girl, signing the blessing together, was broadcast to millions around the world, becoming one of the defining images of Pope Leo XIV's papacy. Later, in a private moment before she departed, Sophia presented the Pope with a gift, a photograph of her grandmother Isabella from the 1980s, standing alongside a young Father Prevost as they taught a sign language class in Chicago. "She always believed in you," Sophia signed. "She said that someday you would help deaf people be heard." Pope Leo XIV studied the photograph, touching the face of his old friend with reverence. "Isabella once told me something I've never forgotten," he signed back to Sophia. "She said that God gave us two hands not just to work and build, but to speak when voices fail. Your hands, Sophia, have spoken volumes." As Sophia prepared to return to Chicago to begin her high school studies, she left behind a Vatican transformed. The inclusive ministry had become one of the Church's most successful outreach programs, with centers in over 60 countries. The Swiss Guards now routinely trained in sign language and other communication methods for people with disabilities. And Pope Leo XIV had become known as the Listening Pope, not just for his attention to spoken words, but for his recognition that communication takes many forms. In her final audience before departing Rome, a reporter asked Sophia what she hoped her legacy would be. The question seemed enormous for a 12-year-old, but she answered without hesitation. "I hope people remember that sometimes the smallest gestures can echo the loudest," she signed as her mother interpreted, "and that when we truly see each other beyond our differences, that's when miracles happen." As her plane lifted off from Rome, Sophia looked down at the shrinking dome of St. Peter's Basilica. She thought about the unlikely chain of events that had connected her grandmother's past to her own future, about a promise kept across decades, and about how the startled reaction of the Swiss Guards had ultimately helped validate the importance of what was happening. She reached into her pocket and felt the new rosary the Pope had given her, designed specifically for praying with hands rather than voice. Each bead had a slight texture difference that could be felt rather than seen, allowing prayer in complete darkness. Sophia closed her eyes and began to move her fingers over the beads, her hands forming the ancient prayers in their new language. As the plane banked toward home, she smiled at the thought of all the children who would now be able to speak to God in their own way, with hands that could finally be heard. And in the Vatican below, Pope Leo XIV stood at his window, watching. Sophia's plane disappear into the clouds. He made the "I love you" sign toward the sky, followed by the heart tap that had become their special connection. A nearby Swiss guard noticed and repeated the gesture with a smile, no longer shocked, but honored to be part of a movement that had started with a child's courage and a pope's willingness to remember a promise made long ago. The legacy of that moment in St. Peter's Square, when a little girl gave a secret signal to Pope Leo XIV and the Swiss guard's reaction shook everyone, would continue to ripple outward for generations to come, reminding the world that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with a shout, but with a silent gesture understood by those with eyes to see and hearts open enough to respond.